Saskia set the pen down with the specific deliberateness of someone who has already decided, and a second later, her hands were at the back of my chair, and then her mouth was at the corner of my jaw. Not a question, not a test, a statement delivered in the dark at 11:52 p.m., 38 floors, above a city that was still moving below us like it hadn't been told to stop. My fingers found the edge of the contract on the table, and the paper bent under a grip I had not told my hand to make. Something in my sternum pulled tight and did not release. Her voice arrived directly at my ear, the same register she uses to dismantle opposing counsel. "You've read that page 4 times. Then after a pause that lasted exactly as long as it needed to. "You're not reading it. If you want to hear uncensored too hot for YouTube stories, check out my Patreon in the description. Tell us where you're watching from and subscribe." 3 weeks ago, in this same room, we had been 7 people around a 20-foot mahogany table with 4 separate legal teams and a court reporter and 2 governance consultants who disagreed with each other about everything except that the merger was structurally sound in principle. 3 weeks ago, I had not yet understood the particular nature of the problem I was in. That came later. That came specifically on a Wednesday afternoon when Saskia had taken the document I'd spent 11 hours drafting, a cross-border liability clause with embedded carve-outs that I was quietly proud of, read it for 6 minutes in complete silence while I sat across the table from her and waited, and then picked up a pen and written a single line in the margin and slid the document back to me without comment. The margin note was 8 words. It identified a structural gap I had not seen, would not have seen, and corrected it with an economy of language that I found profoundly irritating precisely because it was correct. I stared at it for 6 minutes. I thought about arguing. I thought about the 3 counter-arguments I could mount in defense of my original structure. Then I picked up my own pen and wrote "agreed" in the margin beneath her note, because it was accurate, and because I was a professional, and because the merger depended on the clause being correct and not on my pride about who had corrected it. I had not, in that moment, looked at her. I had handed the document to the paralegal between us and kept my eyes on the table, and told myself that was simply what working across from a formidable attorney looked like. It felt like an explanation. I filed it as one. That had been the first time I understood the particular problem I was in. Tonight is the final night of the 7-week negotiation. The junior associates went home at 8. The governance consultants left at 9. The senior counsel from both teams packed their materials and said tomorrow morning and shook hands and rode the elevator down, and I watched them go and told myself I would be behind them in an hour. The floor around us has been quiet since 9:30. The building has settled into its overnight register, a low hum in the walls, the HVAC cycling, nothing else. 38 floors below, street traffic moves with the reduced logic of midnight, and if I sit very still, I can feel it faintly through the glass, rather than hear it. A vibration that has no name and requires no response. I had told myself the final review would take 1 hour. It has now been 4. Saskia has not left the table. I have not asked her to. There is, I have concluded, no clean explanation for either of those facts. And I have been a transactional attorney long enough to know that when a clause resists clean drafting, it is because something in the underlying structure is not what it was represented to be. I am 32 years old. I have been lead transactional partner at my firm for 14 months, which is not a long time for that title, and I carry it accordingly, meaning I do not announce it, I do not perform it. I simply arrive in rooms and do the work at a standard that makes the title a retrospective observation rather than a claim. I was brought in for this negotiation specifically for my work on cross-border holding structures, which is a narrow and technical specialty that most of my colleagues find uninteresting and that I find, genuinely and without performance, absorbing. Numbers and language that are required to mean exactly one thing each in 3 jurisdictions simultaneously. There is a precision to it that I find satisfying in the way other people find clean angles satisfying, or resolved chord progressions, or a sentence with no waste in it. I am good at my work. I am also, and I say this with the dry, self-directed honesty I reserve for the interior of my own skull, apparently not as good at other things as I believed. I had been in this building for 7 weeks. In 7 weeks, I had attended 41 formal negotiation sessions, reviewed approximately 1,400 pages of draft documentation, consumed a quantity of bad conference room coffee that I have stopped counting, and had, this is the relevant figure, not once made eye contact with Saskia Creel for longer than the sentence I was currently finishing required. This had been a deliberate professional discipline, the kind of discipline I am good at, the kind that operates below the level of explicit decision and becomes simply a feature of how you move through a room. What it had cost me to maintain was a question I had not been asking. Saskia Creel is the senior managing partner of the M&A legal division at the opposing firm. This means that in the context of this negotiation, she holds all structural authority on her side of the table, that every clause she marks carries the weight of final review, and that the 14 associates who report to her in this building would, I had observed this over 7 weeks, do anything she required with a combination of genuine respect and something that is not exactly fear, but is adjacent to it. She writes terms. She does not accept terms written around her without examining them. She has, in my observation, an almost perfect stillness at rest. Not the stillness of someone waiting, but the stillness of someone who has already decided what will happen next and is simply allowing the timeline to arrive at the place she is prepared for it. I noticed this in week 1. I filed it under Qualities of Effective Opposing Counsel, and I closed the file. She entered the building on the first morning of week 1 at 8:47 a.m., while 12 people stood around the lobby coffee station, making the small noise of professionals at the start of a significant project. And what she did to the room was not dramatic. It was not announced. It was simply that the room rearranged itself around her entrance. Conversations did not stop, but they recalibrated. The air in the lobby moved differently. 3 separate people shifted their body positions without appearing to know they had done it. She walked through all of it at the specific pace of someone who has never once moved at the pace a room expected. And she wore a dark charcoal blazer and carried a single document folder and did not look at the coffee station. I was at the far end of the lobby, reviewing my notes on my phone, and I registered her entrance as data without turning it over. That was what I told myself. I also remember with some precision the exact moment she turned toward the elevator and the way her profile in that light, the overhead lobby fluorescents at 8:47, which were not flattering to anyone, reorganized something in the geometry of the room that had been fine a moment before. I put my phone in my pocket and went to the elevator and stood in it with 6 other people and did not look at her once. She smelled of cedar and cold linen. The elevator was small. I categorized this and moved on. In week 2, she stopped me in the corridor outside the secondary conference room to clarify a reference I'd made to a jurisdictional carve-out in the offshore holding provision. This was a legitimate professional exchange. She stood in the corridor and asked me one precise question and listened to my answer with the complete attention of someone who genuinely processes everything she receives. No social approximation, no waiting for her turn. And then she said, "The carve-out is correct. The reference to the governing statute is one addition behind." And she handed me a page she had already marked, and I took it. And she walked back into the conference room, and I stood in the corridor for a moment with the marked page in my hand and the very specific sensation that something in the structure of the next several weeks had just shifted in a way I had not authored. The marked page was helpful. The statute reference was indeed one addition behind. I updated the clause. I did not think about the corridor exchange again that day. I thought about it at 11:37 p.m. in my hotel room across the street, and I assigned it no significance and went to sleep. In week 3, she wrote the margin note on my liability clause and handed it back without comment. This I have already described. What I have not described is what happened in the 3 seconds after I wrote "agreed" beneath her note and passed the document to the paralegal. In those 3 seconds, I looked up, and she was already looking at me, and the eye contact lasted. I know this because I counted it, with the precise part of my brain that keeps doing its job when the rest of me has stopped. It lasted 4 full seconds, which is 2 seconds longer than any of our previous eye contact, which had been capped at 2 seconds by a professional discipline I had not formally articulated but was absolutely maintaining. At the 2-second mark, she should have looked away. She did not look away. At the 4-second mark, I looked away. I looked at the table. I picked up my coffee cup and found it was empty and set it back down. The paralegal said something about scheduling, and I answered it. I had described this in the filing system of my own interior life as a moment of unusual eye contact between 2 professionals at the end of a significant exchange, not indicative of anything beyond the intensity of the work environment. This was an accurate description, the way a map is accurate. Technically correct, no elevation data does not convey what it costs to actually climb the thing. Week 4, 5, and 6 had occurred. I will not describe them in detail because the detail would be the same room, the same table, the same document in various states of revision, and the accumulated specific weight of being in a room with Saskia Creel 40 hours a week while maintaining the professional discipline of someone who has correctly identified that this is not the appropriate context for whatever it is she is identifying. The weight had accumulated the way weight does, not all at once, not dramatically, but in the compound interest way of small units that do not announce themselves as additions until the total is already significant. By week 6, the total was significant. I had not yet done anything about it. I was not going to do anything about it. The merger was the only document I was here to finalize, and I was going to finalize it and return to my office and write a very good summary memo and close this particular chapter with the professional cleanliness I applied to everything. This had been my position. Tonight is week 7. Tonight is the final night. And at 11:40 p.m., when the last paralegal had packed up and the floor had gone quiet and I was sitting at the end of the boardroom table with page 9 of the final draft and Saskia was across the table from me reading page 12, I had told myself, 1 more hour. An hour ago, I had thought, 45 minutes. Now it is 11:52 p.m., and neither of us is reading. The boardroom is glass on 3 sides, floor-to-ceiling windows on the east and south walls, the city below in the specific way. City lights look from 38 floors up at midnight. Not individual sources of light, but a distributed luminance, a grid of illuminated intention, enough to see by without being seen by. The overhead fluorescents have been off since 10 p.m., when one of the associates turned them down for the last break, and I had not turned them back on, and Saskia had not asked me to. The only artificial light is the single halogen task lamp on the table, angled at the contract pages, which throws a warm gold pool across 12 pages of paper and leaves everything else in the city's ambient blue cool. In this light, Saskia's face is half warm, half lit from below by the city, and I have made a sustained effort not to have opinions about this. She's sitting across and slightly down from me at the table's end. Her dark charcoal blazer is open, the way it has been since hour 7, when she did the things she did without ceremony or apparent self-consciousness. Simply reached up and undid the single button at the collar with one hand while continuing to read. I had observed this with the peripheral vision of someone actively not watching. The black silk underneath caught the boardroom light in a way I categorized as a neutral fact about fabric under directed light and absolutely nothing else. Her hair is jet black, straight to her collarbone and slightly disheveled on the left side from where she pushed it back at hour 9. I know it was hour 9 because I noted the time when it happened, the way I note timestamps on everything, out of professional habit and not for any other reason. The contract is between us. 12 pages. The corners of pages 3, 7, and 9 bear the specific micro-curvature of paper that has been held by fingers under pressure, and those are the pages I have held. The pen, her pen, a matte black roller ball set down on the table beside page 12 at hour 6, has been picked up by me twice, used to annotate, and set back down. I am aware, in a way I have not yet classified to my satisfaction, of this pen as a discrete object with a specific location. The room smells of cold coffee, paper, and cedar. I am cataloging this as a professional exercise. At 11:38 p.m., 14 minutes before the cold open, Saskia reached across the table to indicate a clause on page 9. Page 9 is on my side of the table. She had leaned forward from her chair, her forearm coming to rest on the table edge, 6 inches from my wrist, which was resting beside the page, and pointed at the 3rd paragraph of section 12.4 with one finger, and said in the same even register she uses in depositions, "The indemnification cap in this paragraph needs to align with the liability schedule in Schedule F. If we sign it as drafted, the exposure differential will surface in the first post-closing audit." She was correct. I had noted this discrepancy 3 days ago and flagged it internally, but had not yet raised it formally because I was waiting for the liability schedule to finalize. And the liability schedule had finalized at noon today, and this was the first session since then, and I had intended to raise it myself at the opening of the final review. She beat me to it by 47 minutes, which is the kind of thing she does. I said, "Agreed. The cap needs to move to reflect the amended Schedule F numbers." My voice was the voice of someone reviewing a legal document at 11:38 p.m., which was accurate in every technical sense. I looked at the page. I did not look at her forearm, which was still on the table 6 inches from my wrist. Section 12.4 C or D, she said. Both, I said. The exposure differential threads through both paragraphs. She did not answer immediately. She was reading the paragraph again, and I was aware of this reading as a physical fact in the room. Not as sound, since she reads silently, but as a quality of her attention taking up space. Her forearm was still on the table. I had made no move to suggest she remove it. I had also made no move that could be construed as anything else, because there was nothing to construe. Because this was a legal document review at 11:38 p.m., and that was the only document currently open. She said, "You're right, both." And then she said nothing else and did not move, and her forearm remained on the table for 4 more seconds. 4 seconds is not a long time. It is enough time to read 2 sentences of dense legal prose. It is also enough time for the right side of my body to complete a separate calculation entirely without consulting me, registering the proximity of her forearm with the specific alertness of a system that has been on low-grade notice for 7 weeks and has been instructed repeatedly to stand down. Her forearm was not touching me. The 6 inches between us contained nothing but the ambient temperature of a glass boardroom at midnight and the faint, warm gold from the task lamp. The 4 seconds passed. She straightened. The right side of my body did not immediately return to baseline. I did not annotate this. She moved back to her chair, and we continued reviewing. Page 10, 11. She asked a clarifying question about the escrow mechanics in the offshore holding structure. I answered it. She asked a follow-up. I answered that too. These were normal professional exchanges conducted in a normal professional register, and if the space on the table where her forearm had been continued to hold some thermal or atmospheric differentiation that I was aware of with the side of my wrist, that was a function of attention and not of anything else. And attention is a professional tool, and I was using it professionally. The contract was between us. It had been between us for 7 weeks. It had functioned, in a way I was only now beginning to examine with the kind of honesty that arrives after 11 p.m., as the only reliable surface in the room. The thing both of us could look at, refer to, address questions toward, without addressing what else we were doing. Document as neutral ground, document as architecture, building the room we could both survive being in. I turned to page 12. At 11:44 p.m., Saskia picked up the contract. Not her section of it. My page. The page I had been annotating, which was on my side of the table. She reached across and took it with the specific nonchalance of someone who has been moving through shared document space for 7 weeks and has stopped accounting for jurisdictional edges. She set it in front of her beside her own pages and began reading it, and I watched her do this and said nothing because there was nothing to say. It was a shared document. We were reviewing it together. The fact that she had simply taken it from my side of the table was a professional decision made without social negotiation, and that was consistent with how she moved through every room she occupied. I had no remaining page in front of me. I looked at the 12-page stack in the center of the table. I could reach for another page. I did not. I sat with my hands folded on the table, and I watched her read my page, and I became aware, with the clarity of someone who has been not asking a question for 7 weeks and suddenly cannot maintain the not asking, that the document between us was not the contract. The contract was incidental. The contract had been incidental since some point I could not precisely date, though I suspected it was somewhere in week 3, during the 4 seconds of unplanned eye contact at the end of the margin note exchange. The contract had continued to function as our shared fiction through week 4, 5, and 6, and we had both agreed to it without ever agreeing, the way you can both agree to something in a room without ever saying the words, simply by continuing to behave as if it is true. It had stopped being true. I was sitting at a table at 11:44 p.m. without a document in front of me and no explanation for why I had not reached for one. And across from me, Saskia was reading my page with the complete focused attention of a woman who does everything with complete focused attention, and the room held the sound of nothing, just the HVAC hum, and somewhere, through the glass, the faint, undifferentiated murmur of city traffic 38 floors below. Reaching us as sensation more than sound. A vibration in the glass wall that I could feel if I pressed my palm against it. I did not press my palm against it. I sat at the table, and I looked at Saskia reading, and I did not reach for another page. She looked up. Not at me, at the document. She was still reading, and then she did reach for another page, and her hand moved across the table, and then slowed, and stopped, and she set her hand flat on the table with no page under it, and she did not continue the motion. The room held this for 3 seconds, she said at the volume of a question asked to a room with 2 people in it who are not performing. The offshore indemnification language in Section 9. When you drafted the original version, the one before the Week 3 revisions, were you already anticipating the Schedule F differential? I said, yes. She said, you drafted it to surface the gap. I said, I drafted it to demonstrate the gap existed. Whether it surfaced was a function of whether anyone on your side read Schedule F against Section 9C in the same review session. A pause. She said, I read it in the first session. I said, I know. The room held this too. 2 professionals sitting at a table at 11:44 p.m. in a glass boardroom with a city below them that did not know it was supposed to stop, having just said, in the language of contract structure and review strategy, something that was not about contract structure at all. She looked back at the document. I looked at the table. Neither of us reached for any further pages for a long moment, and the document between us, 12 pages, cover sheet, exhibit list, the corners of 3 pages slightly curved from where I had held them under the specific grip of someone trying to stay inside the room she's in, sat between us doing nothing, which was now the truest thing it had ever done. At 11:47 p.m., Saskia read a clause aloud. This was not unprecedented. We had read sections aloud to each other throughout the 7 weeks when the language required a second voice to catch ambiguity, or when the hour was late enough that reading silently stopped surfacing the errors. It was a functional tool, and I had used it myself. I had no reason, in terms of professional protocol, to respond differently to it than I ever had. What was different was the register. She had picked up page 11, the governance structure provisions, the section we had revised the most over the 7 weeks, the section whose current language represented the single largest compromise between both firms. And she began reading from the 3rd paragraph, and her voice had dropped a full register below the deposition tone. Not below it in the way of someone who is tired, or losing the thread, or winding down at the end of a long session. Below it in the specific way of a voice that has stopped performing its professional register and has arrived, instead, at its actual register, the one that exists before the room requires anything from it. I knew the difference. I had been aware, in peripheral ways, of this distinction for weeks. I had not allowed myself to examine it directly. She was reading governance language. Clause 11.3a, the post-merger oversight structure, the board composition requirements, the language about shared decision-making authority in the transitional period. It was dense, highly technical language with no narrative quality whatsoever, and she was reading it at a volume intended only for the 2 feet of air between us. And her voice at that register did something in the quiet of the empty floor that I would have difficulty classifying as a neutral data point. It landed. That was the only way I had. It landed in the room the way something placed deliberately is different from something simply set down. I was aware of it in my chest, in the specific location, somewhere below my sternum that had been developing an inconvenient opinion about Saskia Creel's voice since approximately week 2, and which I had been managing with the diligence of someone who knows the opinion is incorrect and keeps managing it anyway. The warmth of her forearm was still present on the air beside my wrist from the earlier contact, or I was assigning it presence, which amounted to the same sensory fact. The task lamp was throwing its warm gold pool across the remaining pages between us. My own breathing, if I had measured it, would not have survived a clinical reading. She was reading Clause 11.3b, the language of shared authority, transitional governance, the careful architecture of 2 structures becoming one. I was hearing it at a level that had entirely decoupled from its legal content. She stopped. Not at the end of the paragraph, not at a natural syntactical break, not at the period after 30-day review period, or the comma after designated oversight committee. She stopped mid-sentence. The specific sentence, I know it because I know this document, I could locate that sentence at 3 a.m. from memory, was the one about the conditions under which unilateral action by either party is prohibited during the transitional period, and she stopped in the middle of it on the word conditions. and the sentence remained unfinished in the air between us. The silence that followed was 4 seconds long. 4 seconds is the same duration as the silence after her forearm remained on the table. I did not think this was coincidence. I thought it was a pattern, and I thought patterns are what you look for when the contract language is not telling you what the underlying structure actually is. And I thought, this is the document. This is the real document. Everything else has been exhibit material. I did not say any of this. I sat in the 4 seconds of silence with my hands on the table and my breathing at its inconvenient pace, and I looked at the lamp's warm gold pool on the pages, and I waited. The HVAC hummed. The city traffic moved below us in its faint vibration through the glass. At the end of the 4 seconds, Saskia set down page 11 and reached for the cold coffee cup she had not touched in over an hour. She didn't drink from it. She held it. She looked at the window. I looked at her profile in the city light, and I stopped filing anything. At 11:50 p.m., I turned to Saskia, and I said, in the voice I use when I have finished the internal argument and arrived at a position, "You can stop." The room changed. She went still. Not the stillness of her ordinary mode, which is the stillness of precision and intention, but a different stillness, the stillness of a system that has received unexpected input and is holding before processing. It lasted 2 seconds. Her hands were on the table, not moving. Her eyes were on me. The city was behind her through the glass, lit and indifferent. "You can stop," I had said, and I was aware that what I meant was not the clause she hadn't finished reading. And I was aware she knew that, and the fact that she knew it was visible in the specific way her expression did not change. Not held artificially static, not carefully composed, but simply landing on the version of stillness that occurs when you have been shown something you recognize. I had worn the blush lace bralette for myself. I want to be precise about this. I had worn it for the final night, for the version of myself that gets through difficult things. The version that shows up at the end of the hard thing with something kept intact, something private and warm against the skin that has nothing to do with the room or the document or the opposing counsel or any of it. I wore it for myself, and I had not assigned it any significance toward anyone else. And I was now at 11:50 p.m. on the final night, sitting with 2 buttons open at my collar, and Saskia 3 feet away, looking at me with the stillness of someone who has stopped performing, and the bralette was visible at the collar of my ivory blouse, and she looked at it. 1 beat, the length of 1 breath. Then she looked back up. She said, "I didn't start anything." And then quieter, dropped another register below the one that was already not her professional voice. "You did." The dry part of my brain, the part that keeps doing its accounting even when the rest of me has stopped cooperating, produced the following observation. She was technically correct. I had worn something for myself that had arrived in this room as something else entirely, and I had been in this building for 7 weeks, maintaining a professional discipline that was, on reflection, the most sustained act of authorship I had performed in this entire negotiation. The discipline itself had been the document. I had been drafting it for 7 weeks, and it was now at 11:50 p.m. on the final night, exhibiting the same structural gap that I had identified in Section 9C in Week 3. She had read it. Of course she had. She reads everything. I said, "Then neither of us started anything." She looked at me. The city light from behind her was blue cool on the left side of her face, and the task lamp's warm gold caught the right. Her hair was slightly disheveled on the left side from hour 9. The collar of her blazer was open, the silk catching light in the way I had been categorizing as neutral for 7 weeks and was no longer categorizing at all. She stood. She came around the end of the table, not quickly, not tentatively, at the specific pace of someone who has decided and is now simply moving along the timeline she has prepared for. And she stopped at the back of my chair. I could feel the shift in the room's air as she arrived behind me. I did not turn. Her right arm came over the chair back and her forearm came to rest along my shoulder. Fabric on fabric. The dark sleeve of her blazer against my ivory blouse. The warmth of her arm through both layers, held still. Not moving. Present. The weight and temperature of it against my shoulder was something my body registered before I had named it. And what it registered was not alarm or resistance, but something significantly more specific. The particular cellular knowledge of a surface that has been waiting, for reasons it declined to explain, for exactly this configuration. She was close. I could smell cedar and cold linen, and under it now, at this distance, something warmer. The heat of a person at the end of a long night, specific and close, in a way that was no longer categorizable as a neutral fact about proximity. From somewhere in my own chest came a sound I would classify as quiet. I would be wrong. In the silence of the floor at 11:50 p.m., it was audible, and I was aware of this with the same clarity I was aware of everything else right now, which was the clarity of someone who has stopped managing her own awareness and is simply in it. She said, against the top of my hair, "Noor," just my name, the most minimal possible sentence. And the way she said it, at that register, in that room, in the dark, was the most complete legal brief I had ever received. I stood. It was not dramatic. I turned the chair slightly and stood, and I was facing her at a distance of approximately 2 feet, and the city was behind me now, the window at my back, and Saskia was between me and the rest of the room. The table, the contract, the lamp, the cold coffee cups, all of it. And we were looking at each other in the city-lit dark of a glass boardroom at 11:52 p.m. Her hands were at her sides. She was not moving. She was doing the thing she does, the preparatory stillness that is not waiting, but is the specific intention that has arrived at its place in the timeline, and is simply allowing the moment to know it. I said, 7 weeks, she said. Yes, I said. We're not going to pretend it wasn't 7 weeks, she said. No. And then, we're not going to pretend any of it. The contract was on the table behind her. 12 pages, the single halogen lamp illuminating it, the pen she had set down and I had picked up twice. The cold coffee cups, one on each side, hers with the dark rim of the city-lit shadow and mine with the faint transfer of my lipstick. And I noticed that mine was on her side of the table, and I did not know when it had moved there, and I was not going to address that now. She stepped toward me. 1 step. The 2 feet between us became approximately 12 inches, and 12 inches is the distance at which you can no longer attribute what you're feeling to the air, or the light, or the professional category you've been filing things under. Because at 12 inches, the other person is simply there, in the specific physical language of presence that the body speaks below the level of professional registration. I could feel the warmth of her, differentiated from the room's ambient temperature in a way that was discreet and precise. Cedar and that warmer undercurrent and the particular quality of the air at this distance. The air that has been breathed already, that has been inhabited. My hands were at my sides. I was not moving. She was not moving. The city hummed through the glass at my back. She said, "Tell me to stop." It was not, "I'll stop." It was, "Tell me to." The difference was structural. The difference was the entire remaining document. I understood what she was offering. She was offering me the authorship. She was writing the clause with the blank space in it and handing me the pen. And she was doing it at 11:52 p.m. 38 floors above a city that had never once paused on our account, with a contract unfinished on the table between us and both our names on the same firm's letterhead, pending by morning. I looked at her. I looked at the specific quality of stillness she was in, the cost of it, which was visible in the held precision of her hands at her sides, the control that was not absence of feeling but its active compression, the specific work of someone who is choosing, moment by moment, to hold. I took her right hand, right. I moved it from where it was at her side to the 2 open buttons at my collar. Her fingers arrived at the lace edge of the blush bralette, not moving yet, just there, at the exact point where my ivory blouse had been open for the last 6 hours. The blush lace catching the city's ambient blue just beneath the warm gold of the task lamp. And the contact produced a heat differential that was complete and involuntary. The warmth of her hand against the cooler skin at my collarbone, both of us registering this, neither of us moving for 1 breath and then 2. The glass at my back was cold. I can tell you this with precision. The floor-to-ceiling window had been holding the city's midnight temperature for hours, and when I took the small step back that placed my shoulders against it, the cold arrived through my blouse like a fact that required no interpretation. The clear, unambiguous cold of glass at 38 floors, in the thermal logic of a city at midnight. And in front of me, Saskia's hands at my collar, the differential was total. Cold behind me, warmth in front. My body made a decision to stay exactly in it. Her breath went wrong, not dramatically, not loudly, but in the silence of the empty floor at 11:52 p.m., in the specific acoustic quality of a glass boardroom with its fluorescence off and only the city below for light. I heard it, the specific catch, the departure from the controlled rhythm she had maintained for 7 weeks in every room I'd been in with her. It lasted 1 second. Then it returned. But it had happened, and it had been audible. and it was the first crack that was not a pause or a stillness or a sentence left unfinished, but was instead a sound she had not chosen to make. I had been waiting, without knowing I had been waiting, to hear exactly that. Her hands were at my collar, not moving yet. Warm at my collarbone, at the lace edge, at the exact point where the blush bralette met the open silk. Patient in the way that is not patience at all, but permission. Waiting, which is the specific kind of waiting that is asking a question without using any of the sounds of one. Below us, 38 floors down, the city traffic moved in its faint register through the glass. The sound of it had been there for hours. I had been hearing it without attending to it the way you hear the building hum. The HVAC, the absorbed silence of a floor that has emptied. But now, with my back against the glass, and Saskia in front of me, and the cold at my spine, and her warmth at my collarbone, and the specific breath she had not chosen to make still resonant in the air between us. Now I heard it, the specific low pitch of a city at midnight moving 38 floors below two women who had spent 7 weeks writing terms around each other. And I knew, with the part of me that files things under the correct heading, that I would remember that sound for a long time, the specific frequency, the particular character of city traffic that was simply the world going on below us while something irreversible was happening. She said, "Noor, just my name, again, in that register." I said nothing. There was nothing that required saying. The document had been drafted. We were past the drafting stage. Both her hands moved. Afterward, the room had the quality of a document that has been signed. Not finished exactly, because signed documents always contain the future implications of their own language, but settled. The thing it was going to be, it now was. Saskia was in her chair. She had retrieved her blazer from where it had been hanging on the chair back and put it on. One button closed at the collar now exactly as it had been at the beginning of the evening, which would have been unreadable to anyone who hadn't watched it open. I had sat back at the table. My ivory blouse was partially untucked in a way that I had not yet addressed. The blush bralette was not visible at the collar because the 2 buttons were now closed. The contract was between us. It had always been between us. It would need 2 signatures in the morning. I held page 9. I was looking at clause 12.4, the indemnification cap, the liability schedule differential we had caught at 11:38. The language in front of me was correct. I had annotated it correctly. The clause was sound. I was not reading it. The HVAC hummed. The city moved below. The task lamp was still on, its warm gold pool crossing the table between us, and the cold coffee cups were still where they had been. Mine, I now confirmed, was on Saskia's side of the table. Neither of us had moved it. I did not know exactly when it had migrated, but it had, at some point in the 7 weeks, crossed the distance between my side and hers, and neither of us had said anything about it. And there it was. Saskia stood. I heard the specific quality of her movement, the resolution of it, that particular pace. And I looked up from page 9, and she crossed the room toward the window where I had moved after the chair. She stopped behind me. I did not turn. 2 fingers, the specific cool of 2 fingers that had been warm a moment ago and had returned to their ordinary temperature in the room's ambient air, arrived at the nape of my neck, under my hair, right at the base of the skull, where the hair ends and the skin of the neck begins, and she left them there, not moving, not pressing, simply there, the weight of 2 fingertips against that specific nerve-close territory, the place I would have described, if asked, as the location at which I had been on low-grade alert for 7 weeks without knowing I was expecting anything in particular. I stood at the window with page 9 in my hands and 2 of Saskia's fingers at my nape, and the city, 38 floors below, doing what cities do. The merger agreement was unsigned. It would be signed in the morning. The final clause, Section 15, the termination provisions, drafted by me at 11:47 p.m. and reviewed by no one before it went into the final stack, contained an asymmetry that I had introduced deliberately and quietly in the specific way of a transactional attorney who knows how to write a structure with a weight-bearing implication that only surfaces on close reading in the post-closing period. I had introduced it without announcement. I would not announce it now. Saskia's 2 fingers were still at my nape, still not moving. The cold of the glass was at the front of me and her fingers were at the back. And the city was below and the contract was in my hands and both our names were going to be on the same firm's letterhead by morning. I had worn the blush bralette for myself, for the version of myself that gets through difficult things. I had gotten through this one. I was in fact still getting through it in the specific ongoing sense of a process that has not concluded, even when it appears, from the outside, to have resolved into a room with a signed document and 2 women standing at a window at 1 a.m., page 9. The indemnification cap. The liability schedule, amended, correct. I turned the page. The contract moved in my hands with the specific sound of paper. 12 pages of 7 weeks of work between 2 firms and 2 women who had been writing terms around each other for the entire duration. And behind me, 2 fingers at the nape of my neck did not move, and the city below us did not stop, and neither of us said anything. In the morning, the junior associates would arrive at 7 a.m. They would find the boardroom with its papers and the cold coffee cups and the task lamp that had been left on, and they would find the coffee cup with the faint transfer of Noor's lipstick on the rim, on Saskia's side of the table, exactly where neither of them had moved it. They would not remark on it. It would simply be there, the way things are simply there when they have arrived at their correct position after a long transit. And no one moves them because moving them would require acknowledging the transit, and some documents you simply leave on the table and proceed to the next item on the agenda. The city moved below. The 2 fingers did not move. I held the contract and I looked at the glass, and I did not turn the page again.